By 1986, the Nintendo Famicom and its Western counterpart, the NES, received much third-party support from the likes of Capcom, known for the Mega Man games, Sunsoft, developer Blaster Master, Hudson Soft, known for their Adventure Island games, and our focus for today, Konami. Hitoshi Akamatsu, a developer at Konami, was given the task to direct the making of a new game for the Famicom disk system, while a second team would produce a version of the same game for the MSX2, a popular Japanese computer, ironically initially conceived by Microsoft of all things. Konami was no stranger to the MSX, since several of their biggest titles were released on the platform, most famous being Metal Gear. But unlike that game that started life on the MSX, Akamatsu's new game would be designed for the Famicom disk system, with the MSX version being based on it. However, due to the MSX not being as capable as the Famicom in terms of background scrolling, the levels would have to be modified to make up for this limitation, by adding a series of static screen rooms that can be explored in a non-linear fashion. More on that later. The main reason why this game needed to be released for the Famicom disk system instead of just the base console was due to the 40 kilobyte ROM limit of the Famicom, since it could only access that amount from the cartridge. The other reason for using the disk was for cutting costs by trading access speed for more storage, which means, yes, you had to sit through a loading screen. As a fan of Western films, Akamatsu wanted to do a game that had a lot of cinematic elements. He settled on doing a horror-themed game, since the Universal monster movies of the early to mid-20th century, as in Universal Pictures, were some of his favorite. He settled on the idea of a vampire hunter tasked to hunt down the infamous Dracula, and thus the game would be given the title of Dracula's Devil Castle. Even though Dracula was the big bad of the game, it would also include boss fights from equally popular monsters like the Mummy and Frankenstein's monster. But Akamatsu would also include boss fights from other popular media and mythology, such as the Grim Reaper and an encounter with Medusa's head. As you play the game for the first time, you might notice that you only have a whip as your main weapon, that when whipping anything with a flame, such as a lit candlestick, an item drops. Some of these items can be power-ups and money for points, but more often they'll drop hearts. What do you suppose a heart is used for when you collect it? Well, isn't it obvious? Ammo for your sub-weapons. Okay, so it's not for replenishing health like every other game that has ever existed. So how do you actually heal yourself? Well, you would need to find a brick wall that can be broken with the whip, and a roast chicken or ham or whatever it's supposed to be will appear. Yummy! Sub-weapons can occasionally be dropped from whipping a candle, but how often you can use them is determined by how many hearts you've collected. These sub-weapons are usually something you throw, like a knife or an axe. But as for the other sub-weapons, there is, however, a controversial issue here. So this was during the time when parents started to become worried about how video games, it still being relatively a new medium at this point, could quote-unquote be bad for children. Because of this, all references to Christianity would be censored in all Western releases of Dracula's Devil Castle, including the title itself, since apparently you couldn't have the word devil to describe a video game. A new name would have to be used instead, and they settled on Castlevania, which I think in this case is a much better name for the series. But the censoring also had a lot to do with the sub-weapons. The cross is renamed to the boomerang. The holy water becomes the firebomb. I guess a reference to holy water is bad while referencing napalm is fine. But even more confusingly, the rosary would be renamed to the cross. What? Okay, so this censoring would continue in future Castlevania games such as Castlevania 3, where crosses and other religious symbolism would be removed from tombstones and chapels, even though religious structures in and of itself depicted in entertainment isn't considered to be a form of sacrilege. The character you play as in the game, Simon Belmont, who's part of the long family line of vampire killers, uses a whip instead of a more traditional weapon like a sword or spear. This is a conversation with Hitoshi Akamatsu.
The whip matched the world of the game I wanted to create, and as far as weapons go, whips are great at repelling enemies. Also, because I love Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Again, many ideas taken from popular movies. And to continue this theme of art influencing art, many of the characters would be named after actors or directors that were involved in famous horror films. Our hero, Simon Belmont, who is a descendant of Christopher Belmont, is a reference to Christopher Lee, who played as Dracula in many films from the 60s and 70s. Simon Belmont was originally going to be called Peter Dante, named after the actor Peter Cushing and the director Joe Dante, who are known for their contributions in the horror genre. Akamatsu later explained how to defeat some of the bosses, especially when facing the Grim Reaper.
The game design idea there was to get players to understand how to use the cross and axe sub-weapons. If you can defeat him with only the whip, that means you're really good.
In my opinion, even with the sub-weapon, this game is brutally hard. In most cases, this is due to developers making games harder because of how short they actually were due to storage limitations, and so they would pad out the experience by having players get a lot of game overs where they would have to be forced to start all over again. However, I think in this case, the designers felt that Castlevania wasn't really all that hard, which was a common problem during the 80s as new genres and franchises were being created by young, somewhat inexperienced developers. Most of these developers were pioneers of the modern gaming industry, which is why, while making something that suits their idea of what would be normal difficulty, they did not realize just how good they got at playing the game during developing and testing for hours on end. This became apparent when someone asked Akamatsu why was the game so hard? Why does the hero experience so much knockback that can potentially cause him to fall off screen and lose a life? He replied with,
Simon doesn't die from one hit, Mario does.
Which he might be implying that Castlevania is easier than Super Mario, which it really wasn't. These cases were very common during the NES era, which is why many retro enthusiasts, when talking about one of these games, refer to this phenomenon as NES hard. So, like people would say, Mega Man is NES hard. Castlevania would be released in September of 1986 for the Famicom Disk System. However, they had a bit of a problem. Because the Western NES did not get a disk system of its own, the only way they could release the game was on cartridge, but the game was 128 kilobytes in size, over 3 times larger than the 40 kilobyte limit that the NES could access at any given time. Fortunately, around this time, bank switching chips were introduced that allowed the cartridge to switch between multiple 40 kilobyte chunks of the game's ROM, which allowed for NES games to be much longer and more complex. In fact, due to the unreliability of the Famicom disk system and the somewhat common failure rate of the discs themselves, Japan would eventually get a cartridge version of Castlevania, which would retain that name rather than reuse the title Dracula's Devil Castle. This is probably due to them just reusing the modified ROM of the Western cartridge version of the game. Although I cannot find the exact sales figures for Castlevania, it was popular enough to warrant several sequels, but the road to that success was really bumpy, because Hitoshi Akamatsu was removed from the Castlevania project after the third entry underperformed. He would go on to work on the second Metal Gear installment and the arcade beat-em-up adaptation of Asterix. But he would leave Konami to work on other projects until he completely left the gaming industry sometime during the early 2000s. The Castlevania franchise would finally find financial success with its fourth entry on the Super NES, and especially with Castlevania Symphony of the Night for the PlayStation, with the latter expanding on the non-linear design that was first seen in the MSX2 version of Castlevania 1, way back in 1986, which for some strange reason was neither called Castlevania or Dracula's Devil Castle, but was named as simply Vampire Killer. The popularity of Symphony of the Night and the Metroid games from Nintendo influenced the creation of a new genre called Metroidvania. At the time of this recording, there have been 31 games released in the Castlevania series. As probably the most successful, unabashful love and celebration of classic horror ever seen in gaming, Castlevania's charm speaks to the inner morbid curiosity found in each of us, which is why I still play this game, even if, to this day, still kicks my butt. Until next time.